Hi, everyone. This is Sister Elizabeth, and I'm here today with my good friend and co-host, Sister Liz. We're doing a interview today with Gayle Boss, who is the author of two books that I have just fallen in love with. One is an Advent book called All Creation Waits, and the other is a book for Lent called Wild Hope, Stories for Lent from the Vanishing. And both of them have just been fascinating. And Gayle, when I looked at some of her life, she has a long love for animals, spiritual texts and practices, and she melds both of those and all of those into poems and essays that explore these relationships with animals. And as we talk with Gayle, we'll learn more about them. She's the mother of two grown sons. Gayle lives and writes in West Michigan and with her husband, and they have a rescue corgi. Josie, doesn't surprise me that she does. Yeah. So we're here with Gayle today. So Gayle Boss, we are so delighted for you to be here with us today.
Thank you. I'm delighted to join you too. This is my first time on the podcast hosted by two sisters. So as in none.
Wow,
Congratulations.
It's yeah. We hope we we hope we do okay. So we were thinking as we were discussing these books, Sister Liz and myself, they're just beautiful. They're illustrated by David Klein, and so the illustrations are exquisite. But the writing and your description of these different animals throughout the books were really fascinating. So I think let's just dive right in. What prompted you to write these? What's inspired you to write these books? And tell us a little bit to give our readers some sense of what you're trying to do with these meditation books for both Advent and Lent.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you mentioned, Sister Elizabeth, I've had a deep draw to animals, all kinds of them, for as long as I can remember. For example, I remember as a child wanting to sleep in the barn with my cousin's Shetland pony. Well, they seemed to regard the pony as just another thing we played with on the farm, like the tree swing, which disappointed me and puzzled me at the same time. But even when I was a writer, I didn't write about animals, I think because I feared being called sentimental or foolish if I were to write about them, because that was the impression that I had when I would express any of my attachment to animals, that my responses were, oh, I don't know, like something out of a fairy tale, not fit for real life. So I didn't want to seem sentimental and foolish, and so I didn't write about this deep love of my life until I had children of my own. And then I saw in them this infectious abandonment to wonder and curiosity and affection. And so then I allowed myself to have those responses too, in order to join my children in that awe and wonder and curiosity and affection. All Creation Waits, to talk about the first book that I wrote. I tell this story in the book's introduction. It grew out of an Advent calendar I made for my sons. I knew that the liturgy of Advent was all about waiting in the dark for the return of the light of the world. I should say too that I had this converts passion for Advent and Advent waiting, because I was raised in a Protestant tradition that didn't even use the word. I didn't even know what Advent was until I was introduced to Catholics in my 20s. And so I, as a convert to this season, this liturgical season, I was all excited about waiting in the dark for the light of the world to dawn upon us. And then when I had children, I thought, oh, a good way to introduce them to the richness of Advent would be to have an Advent calendar in my home. So I went looking for one in Christian bookstores, secular, all kinds of bookstores. And the only two that I could find, two kinds that I could find, this was back in 1995, were those that had pictures of candy canes and gift packages behind the little doors, and those that featured the cast of the Nativity. And I thought, these are Advent calendars, these are Christmas calendars. So of course I had no choice but to make my own Advent calendar. Well, in a stroke of God's providence, days before I decided to make that Advent calendar, my son's godmother sent me just out of the blue her reflection on painted turtle as a very good symbol for what a healthy soul might do when it is in a dark place. The soul in a dark time, she wrote in a letter to me, could do what turtle does. So I drew a turtle on my Advent calendar because she gave me a striking image of why waiting in the dark can be a restorative practice. And I drew a turtle because my sons, like all small children, just loved pictures of animals. After that, the other animals started queuing up to be on my Advent calendar. There was a bear, a loon, a snake, a doe, all of them symbols I discovered for how a healthy soul responds when things begin to look a little threatening, dark and cold. Well, it took me about 18 years to come up with the idea that this Advent calendar for my very small children could be a book of reflections for adults. I guess my mind and heart were busy with other things for 18 years. But I also now think in retrospect that there probably would not have been a readership for this book in 1995, 96. It's only lately that we're coming to regard animals with the kind of respect and awe that Meister Eckhart refers to in the epigraph to the book. Every creature is a word of God and a book about God. I think we're only lately, some of us, coming to that. And so now there's a readership for this book, and I don't think there was 20 years ago.
I think we should talk about some of the ones we love from All Creation Waits. Sister Elizabeth has a couple of favorites she wanted to share with you.
Yeah. So I really love the idea that it came from an Advent calendar for your children. And I think it's really interesting because I think it's that sense of childlike wonder that then appeals to adults later who are kind of reading through this book during Advent. And it's certainly Laudato Si and the focus of creation that the Holy Father, Pope Francis, has called us to. I think, to your point, kind of brings out more the focus of these animals in the way that they live and the way that they find restoration and life through the darkness. I particularly read Painted Turtle. That was the first one, and I really felt myself down in the muck and the quiet and just that way of trying to almost come into a stasis, so you can find some healing in that space of no chaos. There's nothing happening in there, and that you can emerge from it. I've used this book now at least 3 times for different book groups during Advent, but it's been here in the seminary. And for those who are listeners know, this is a place, it's like a novitiate, as other communities would call it. And I'm working with 5 brand new Daughters of Charity. And we used this book this Advent, and exactly on cue, they did exactly what others have done. They've said, did you read Skunk today? And did you read about the loons? And they were seeing themselves in their own process because, this period of time in their lives is one where they have stepped away from the day-to-day culture they were living in. They've done something very countercultural, and they've moved into this space. And so they were beginning to see themselves in these animals, hibernating in a way, and then recognizing that through that time they will reemerge as new young women, as sisters, as daughters of charity, as women dedicated to service of the poor through their commitment to God and community. So so I found that really fascinating that it started with your sons in an Advent calendar and ends up in a novitiate of young daughters of charity going through a process very similar to an Advent-like experience.
That's the first time that application has ever been pointed out to me. I mean, I've heard people talk about it as times when they're under stress or under grief. I've heard of grief groups that use the book, and that being a time when we need to withdraw, but never this other kind of withdrawal into formation for religious life. I just love that it can be used in that way. It serves like the Holy Spirit at work.
Yes. Yeah. I think the 3 that I want to point out the most, that they each had their own animal that they felt kind of represented them. But the three that really struck the group were skunk, and this idea that these are sister skunks, that they're all together and that they huddle together, and that the heavier ones, the ones that are a little bit healthier, kind of go onto the edge so they can protect the others who aren't doing so well. And they kind of saw that as the way they work and help one another. When one's doing well, she's can be a support to the other. And bees, I mean, they just love the idea of the shivering bees keeping the hive warm, and that they all have to do that together. So it wasn't just their own personal individual identifier with each of the animals, but it was a communal identifier as well. Some of the animals are very singular, but some of them really depend on the community. And I think the one that fascinated them the most was the loon, the sense of the loon having its flight wings, its flight feathers, to get where it needs to go, which I think in some ways they've felt like they've had to get here, to get to this point of discernment and formation. And then they lose them all and they're grounded, and then
Oh,
they have to regrow them. I'm telling you, that is the image of a novitiate, if I've heard one. It's great.
Gayle, do you have any that you thought, oh, this definitely mirrored something in my own experience? Like I'm a social worker and therapist by trade, and so I'm always thinking like, ooh, the psychological aspect or the trauma response or those kinds of things. But how people respond to darkness of either I need to go off by myself, or really like in the sense of the animals slow things down, they slow their heartbeat and metabolism and just kind of go into this almost inert kind of time. Is there one that you'd be willing to share with us that kind of resonates with something from your own experience?
yeah, yes. And I will say that I love them all. I can't pick a favorite per se, because it's like asking someone to pick their favorite child, a mother to pick her favorite child. Different ones echo inside me more strongly at different seasons, different years of my life. Last Advent 2021, I was on a retreat that was using this book. They invited me to come along and to read some of them. And the exercise at the beginning of the retreat was to walk around the room and look at the woodcuts, the illustration of each animal, each of the 24 animals in the book, and choose one that was calling your name. This is Advent 2021. And I thought, well, I didn't have any of them call my name. I love them all. I know them all. I've lived with them all for years. But I thought I'll engage this exercise just to be polite. And I walked around the room, and it was like a supercharged magnet right at the center of me, drew me inexplicably and strongly to the common Eastern firefly. And I thought it practically pinned me to the wall and said, listen to me today. And so I sat with that animal during that retreat, and it was very clear to me that a piece of writing I was working on had to follow the life cycle of the firefly, that it needed to go underground and stay underground for a while. It was not ready to be in the light. And I was thinking it was ready to take at least a trial flight. And so I heard that word very strongly, and I let that piece go underground, where it still is. And it's not quite ready, but the animal told me what needed to happen. I mean, I was struggling with that piece of writing. I knew it wasn't quite accomplishing what I wanted it to accomplish, but I didn't need to think it had to go so down deep again.
Mm. Yeah, and what I love is sometimes we sort of put our spiritual life or God into a box, and this is the way that God speaks to me, and this is how I experience him. And we have these things in the church that are so like foundational and important in the sacraments and in scriptures, and those things are great. In addition, God can speak and use all of creation to speak to us. And so that's why I just love what you've done with these two books, because it's like God can't be confined to anything, that he can speak to us in all of these ways. And you know, how Franciscan, you know, like Saint Francis, Pope Francis, of that we can see God in creation and really have something to that we can learn from what's around us. And it's, I think so many of us are stuck to devices and screens that it's, you just want to say, like, look up, look around, and how God is constantly reaching out to us, and how creation speaks to that.
Yeah, I don't think it was Saint Francis, but I can't pick out the saint or mystic at the moment that was the one who said, the natural world is the first book of scripture. It's our first text. And I really believe that it came certainly before the written scriptures.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'd like to see if we can move into the next book, because we are in this time between Advent and Lent. And we're very, very close to Lent actually right now. So this next book, Wild Hope, is a very different one, even though it is still a focus on animals and their own life cycle, their own representation in nature. What can you tell us about Wild Hope as we begin moving toward Lent? What can we expect from this book, and how is it different from from All Creation Waits?
Well, of course, they're both about wild animals, and in both I try to convey just a bit of the amazingness of each creature. But the creatures in All Creation Waits are common animals of the North American woodlands, while the animals in Wild Hope are on the brink of extinction, many of them, and all of them are endangered species around the globe, not just in North America. In All Creation Waits, I wrote about the animals as models for our own selves, our own souls, when we're facing a dark time. In Wild Hope, it's more straightforward. There's a less of a symbolic slant. These animals are imperiled, suffering, and they're suffering because of human choices, our life choices about transportation, about the ways we house ourselves, the ways we entertain ourselves, what we eat, which, if we grasped their amazingness and felt love for them thereby, that's going to lead us to lament when we recognize their suffering, and suffering that we caused. But then, given a glimpse, also in the book, each portrait of an animal gives just a glimpse of people devoting their lives, and I mean devoting their lives, to protecting these amazing creatures. If once we get a glimpse, I hope, of those people, then we'll be moved also not only to lament, but then to move into protection, to care, which will mean changing our lives. It really will. And that, to me, is what Lent is all about, having the hard husks on our hearts break open and acting as the fuller, passionate selves we're made in God's image to be. Now, Wild Hope is a much harder read than All Creation Waits. I mean, I've had readers tell me it's too hard, that they couldn't finish the book. They had to down. I understand that. I mean, I cried most of the way through writing it. But if we don't know the depth of what we've done to these creatures, to God's beauty, and if we don't lament it, then we can't act, and we won't act. And if we refuse to know, well, we're choosing to live as sleepwalkers, like the living dead. If we refuse to know what we have done to the beauty of God.
Yeah, I love it is a harder book to read, but I think Lent is a harder season to walk through as well. And I really appreciated in this book the presence of the animal world and the human world kind of colliding, and then also being in a place of restoration, which is so much a part of what Lent is. You know, it's that sense of looking at our own sinfulness, our own way in which we are not in right relationship with God and the universe, but also those social sins that happen when human beings become greedy or they become reckless or careless. And I just loved that because, as you were saying, that in all creation waits, it was really about the animals and maybe seeing ourselves in it. But here, it's that relationship between the animals and ourselves because we are one in the universe. What we do to one another matters. And so I really appreciate that piece of the book. And I guess, again, another question is there, were there any that particularly touched your heart or helped you to move forward in this book, because it is divided differently as well. It's divided in categories of painful topics of sickness and homelessness that affects these animals. Were there any that just really drew you out and said you need to keep writing more?
Yeah, I want to speak just a moment to the categories since you brought it up. I divided it into the chief reasons that species are going extinct. And of course they overlap. No cause for extinction is what's the word I want to say? Singular anyway. There are multiple causes in every species extinction. But by choosing the chief cause for a group of animals extinction, I then labeled them by words that I hope can call to mind Jesus' parable in Matthew 28, sheep and the goats. So I labeled them the hungry, the homeless, the sick, the imprisoned, captive. And that was a way of calling to mind Jesus's words, what you have done to the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you've done to me. I wanted readers to see that these creatures are the least of these, our brothers and sisters, and that what we offer to them, we do offer to the Christ. As the ones that really moved me, I'll tell you, the animal that got the whole book started was the one that opens the book, the orangutan. I was at my parents' house the Christmas after All Creation Waits was released. And there was on the coffee table there, the newest issue of National Geographic. And it had on the cover the Sumatran orangutan, orange ape. And so I picked it up and I was leafing through the story. And I saw very quickly that this was not a story that was going to make me very Christmassy company with my family. So I tried to bury it underneath the pile of magazines. But there was one picture in that story that would just kept rising up in my consciousness, like when I was waking up in the morning. And it was a picture of 8 baby orangutans in a wheelbarrow. And so I could not get that picture out of my mind. And finally, after about 4 weeks of resistance, I went to the library and I dug out that issue of National Geographic and I read the story. The story of the orangutans, I think because I'm a mother and I'm a rather fierce mother, just wrecked me about the ways orangutan mothers have to be killed in order to get their babies away from them, and their babies are gotten away from them to traffic, and they're killing orangutans in the first place to make space for palm oil plantations. I was just tremendously undone by that and change. And then, of course, the whole wave of animal suffering around the globe caught me up. But that, I think, is one that put kind of the axe to the root of the tree, to use a biblical metaphor. If you open up your heart to one group of the least of these or of the suffering, you can't do other than to help in every other area where it's possible for you. All of us come with limited time and energy and resources, but if it's not a separate or first this, then that.
Do you have, this is a curiosity, and if we need to cut it out, we can, but like, what would you say to someone who's like that creation stuff, like that's, that's not for us. Like we need to stick with, you know, Jesus in the Gospels, for example, or what have you. Like why incorporate this kind of tactile or these kinds of things about creation into our spirituality? Like what encouragement would you give to somebody who's having those questions, or ideas to sort of step toe in the waters of opening your eyes to God's presence in creation and how God can speak to us?
Hmm. I wonder if those are people who have any visceral, primal experience of the natural world. If you let down your ego defenses and your sense of, Father Richard Rohr calls it the lie of the separate self, if you let down that protection of yourself as separate from everything else, it's almost impossible for you not to be moved by the resilience, the generosity, the beauty, the grace of the natural world. And once you're moved, you automatically move to care and protection. The other thing I would say is what I hinted at just a moment ago: compassion is compassion is compassion. Love doesn't know true love, real love, the love of God doesn't know any kind of segmentation. It would be silly if we were to say, and we'd recognize that it's silly to say, well, God has these boxes for God's love, and God's love for people is more important than God's love for plants. We understand how silly, foolish that is. God is love, love for all things. Well, then how much more so, or how much also true is that if we are made in the image of God?
I think one of the things I've been thinking about is, in this time and in this age, I think we find that younger people, the generations of teens and 20s, maybe even 30s, have a much greater sense and a much more visceral experience of nature, of understanding that the world is just that we really are participating in the destruction of life around us, and that there has to be some answer. And they've really challenged older generations, thinking about Greta Thunberg, of course, who's the one we would know right away. But she really started a movement of young people who are much more conscious of the ways in which we human beings affect the world around us. I guess what I'm wondering, what would you want to say to younger people? You started these, especially All Creation Waits, by wanting to do something with your children. These books can be a little heavy, so how would you suggest using them for younger generations who may get the idea right away, but we might need to find a way to bring it into their lives so that they can reflect on these animals the same way that others have.
I have been surprised with both books that families use them as the center for a family time. I thought I'd written a book for, well, first of all, for myself, my best friend, and my mother. I didn't realize that there would be as large a circle of adults reading it as there is. But I've also been surprised by how young the readers are who absorb this book and want to know more about the creatures and want to act. As an example, I did a reading over Advent with a group of 4, 5, and 6-year-olds at an after-school program, All Creation Waits. And of course, it had a puppet show too. There was one of the persons helping me enacted some of the reading with puppets, and the kids were just enamored with the stories and the animals and the puppets. But then the one little girl came up to me afterwards, and I would say that most of those children came because their parents had introduced them to All Creation Waits before the event. They knew the book and they'd read them as they're in their families. So they were hearing it again and reflecting their love for All Creation Waits and the family experience of reading it together. But I was just speechless when one little 6-year-old girl, Felicity, came up to me and she said, I also like wild hope, and I pray for those animals every night. This is
Oh,
precocious 6-year-old. But I think her mother, I spoke to her mother afterwards and I said, do you really read about the torture of pangolins to this 6-year-old child at bedtime? And she said, first of all, not at bedtime, but second of all, I read ahead and I buffer. If it's a little harsh, I will find a gentler way to say something, or I will skip a part. But she gets the gist of it, that these pangolins are being taken out of their homes, away from their offspring, grown in gunny sacks, carried for days, for weeks across borders in order to be grown in pots of boiling water and stripped of their scales. And she said she gets that. And so we have to learn more about pangolins. We have to give some of her allowance to pangolin protection groups. We pray for them every night. Children are capable of so much more than in our Disney-ified imaginations we think.
Yeah, I think that's a great example of hope, of wild hope, of seeing a child at that age, at 6, or the others that seem so young, and we want to almost protect them. In this case, they are living in a world where they're very conscious of how things are happening and how animals are being abused, and their sensibility is heightened. And to desensitize them or try to protect them isn't going to work. And so there's great hope, I think, that a child at 6 can say, I pray for these suffering animals, might, I think for sure, will develop into an adult who has a much better sense of how her actions and the actions of her family and her friends impacts the world around her. So I really appreciate you sharing that story with us. Yeah,
absolutely.
I will share just one quick story too, just around that idea of going out and looking around. One of the seminary sisters here is from Kalamazoo, Michigan. And so she said, oh, I know Michigan. And so as we're reading this book, when we were reading All Creation Waits, her reaction was, I know these animals, and I've never thought about where do they go during, why they disappear, or where they are when they're not around me. And I think for me, that was a really beautiful reflection of how do we keep in mind that which we don't see every single day, but is so important in our lives, that just because we don't see it, because its life cycle is different than ours, doesn't mean we should not pay attention to it. And so, shout out to her and for you for these 2 beautiful, beautiful books. So we thank you very much, Gayle.
It's been such a pleasure to talk with you. And again, I just have to say, I love having that in my mind, that it has been a resource for women in formation for religious life. I'm going to pull that out in talks that I do.
Feel free.
Yeah, definitely.
Just mention the Daughters of Charity. If you
That's
will.
right.
They all are the pioneers blazing the trail.
That's right. Thanks again, Gayle.